Hello and welcome to another Postcards from Antioch, a training and discipleship podcast from Barson Church. Today, Oz and I are going to be looking at historical narratives as a genre in the Bible. Stories basically, and how we can best read them and understand them, and maybe if we have to speak on them or anything like that.
Yeah, so hopefully some of these themes that we look at, understanding how to engage with them in the Bible will be helpful for us. And everyone loves a story, don't they?
Yeah.
We all love stories, whether that's in the form of a film or in the form of a book, or a personal experience that we then recount to somebody else. So it did make me think, have you got a favourite story or a story that recently you thought, I love that, I read
Favorite
that?
story, yeah. I don't. Generally, well, for a good long while, The Lord of the Rings was my favourite book. I'm not sure it still is, so I don't know what would have replaced it. But actually, I was watching the first film, Fellowship of the Ring, again the other day, and I thought this is just a really well told story. It's just a very good story.
That's what I've got down here,
Yeah.
James. See,
There we go.
that came to me as my favourite story. Whilst the book is quite hard to read in a however many sittings you end up doing it in,
Yeah.
amazing world that is developed, characters, the direction of the story. I don't know if you've seen yet The Rings of Power on Amazon Prime.
I haven't, no.
Okay, because I watched the first episode, and I will watch the series, and they've put a lot of money into it, that's for sure. They've created incredible scene within the series, and I was just reading and hearing some different views on it this week, given that I read it and loved the book and then watched the first one. And one of the comments was that Tolkien's world has been created on screen quite magnificently, even though it's set several thousand years prior. And the question is, would he be happy with the story?
Yeah.
So that's the question that people are asking.
Yeah.
The world's been created in line with the books, but will he agree with the story, the emphasis?
Yeah.
So, the jury's out.
Yeah, well, you can tell me after you've watched all the episodes.
Yes, tell you what I think.
think.
So we're going to think more about Bible stories than
okay.
that particular one, even though Tolkien based a lot of his work on the biblical descriptive.
Yeah, his faith was part of who he was,
wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think a previous episode we were looking at law, and I guess if I was to ask you, James, how many laws could you reel off in, I don't know, 10 minutes, you'd probably dry up in a minute or two.
I reckon I could do about 500 of them.
500 of the 600.
Yeah. No, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Once you get past the 10 Commandments, it begins to get a bit slow going. Yeah.
If I said to you, how many stories could you mention in the Bible? How many could you?
Yeah.
You could go for a while.
There'd be quite a while. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, there are just too many to think of. Like, so many swirling around in my head. I don't know that I could even start because there's just too many of them.
That's right. And so in a way, yourself, and I'm sure many of our listeners today as well, if I were to say a book of the Bible, they could probably mention at least one story from that.
Yeah.
And there's 66 books in the Bible. So I reckon we could get close to 50 plus quite without much work. And that's the beauty of stories. And we might think, well, why is 40% of the Old Testament narrative, historical narrative? Well, it's because God didn't want to just give us a theological essay as a revelation of himself and his plan. He didn't want to just give us some laws, which the people of Israel needed, as we talked about last time. But he decided to communicate theological truths, the nature of himself and of humanity through lived experiences.
Yes. Yeah.
And stories. So that's what we're going to think about. And I guess that stories are memorable, which is what we've mentioned.
Yeah.
Why else are stories a good thing to use?
Well, they're an easy way. Well, you said they're memorable, and I'm thinking every culture tells stories as a way of remembering things and passing on information and understanding the world and the way it works. Stories are a fantastic way of communicating without realizing that you're being communicated to. It's almost like stealth teaching.
Yes. Yes. So we're going to dive into that a little bit and see how stories might not say, you've got to do this, but they leave us thinking, oh, how does that relate to me? Oh, what's the message behind the story?
Yeah.
And as we think about the Old Testament, which is full of historical context that's different, full of different language, culture, time, all those different things, the stories still captivate us. The stories are performed at West End and are in, on Amazon Prime. They're stories that are part of our current culture, and yet they're historic.
Yes.
And they're relevant. So for Christians, the Old Testament is our spiritual history too. And the calling, the promises to Israel become our promises and calling, because we are children of Abraham as well, spiritual children of Abraham, whether we're Jews or Gentiles. That's a part of what we read in the New Testament. And in 1 Corinthians 10, I'll just read a verse and then maybe ask you, James, to read one other. It says, "These things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did." So that was Paul talking to a church in Corinth, having recounted a few Old Testament stories, and said these are an example for us to help us live and make right choices, not wrong choices. So there's a moral imperative that comes. But maybe you could just read as well, before we look back, a few examples. Galatians 3, 7 to 9.
Galatians 3, 7 to 9.
And that will help us to see why, our faith, the faith that we have in the gospel today, is one that started somewhere else, really.
So Galatians 3, 7 to 9. "Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith."
Thank you. So blessed with Abraham, the man of faith. We live by faith. We share that spiritual ancestry. And that's why reading about our great grandparents spiritually and more is inspiring, exciting, an example. So that's what we're going to think about. There's just actually one other passage I think would be helpful in the New Testament, Luke 24 and 44 to 49, to help us think about the one aspect of reading the Old Testament that we should not forget.
Luke 24, 44
to 49.
"He said to them, 'This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms.'" This is Jesus speaking to his disciples. "Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, 'This is what is written. The Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I am going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high."
Thank you. So the key bit there was the first few verses, particularly as we think about all that was written is partly because, about Jesus, because of the gospel that we share and have faith in. So as we read these historical narratives, we appreciate them for the time and place, the literature that it is in its own right. But we also engage as we step back and look at where they point, lead, prepare the way for the one who would fulfill all that was written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the other writings. So historical narratives, that is a huge element. So what are the narratives? We've already said they're a story. They retell historical events. Not so much our story, but God's story through time, through people. And they show us how to live as we get to know characters and the drama that happens with individuals that God is working through. So, what are some of the key features? So, if James, you like to write stories, if you're going to write a story, what are the couple of the key things that you would go, right? It's a story. These are key parts. I need to figure out
Yeah,
what
so
we should
you
do.
think about the characters,
Yeah.
who's the story about, who's telling the story. You think about what you might call the plot. I think, where's the story going? Where's it going to end up? Uh, and sometimes you don't even know that when you start. Um, yeah, you think about who you're writing for, sort of how best to communicate to them. Uh, yeah. Anything else?
Well, the only other part I think that's exactly characters plot would be that kind of plot resolution, that kind of the
Okay,
twist,
the
the turn.
end.
Yeah,
Yeah, how it ends. Yeah,
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 yeah, exactly. And so these are common things that screenwriters, book writers. The other day, I rather than reading a book to my daughter, I decided to tell her a story because she was having a bit of a meltdown. I said, "I've got a story for you," and she suddenly quietened down,
yeah.
and she was just overtired. But I told her this story, and I was just making it up as I went about a lion and a cub and trying to catch a mouse. It's really
Right.
simple,
Okay.
and how. Anyway, I won't tell the whole story, but it was captivating. And as I went, I was like, the different people in it. Is there a twist? Is there a resolution? So this is how we do stories. Um, I wouldn't describe myself as a storyteller specifically. I get away with it with my six
Yeah,
year
yeah,
old. But as we read these stories, yes, we know God's word is inspired by him, but he speaks through people, and they have communicated and written the accounts that often, as we examine them like a story, are just mind blowing, amazing, gripping. And so we've got different books of the Bible. Actually, most of the Old Testament books have narratives within them. Genesis, first bit of Exodus, bits of the other law books, but particularly moving from Joshua through to Ruth,
hmm
and also the Kings, Chronicles. So then we get to the wisdom literature, and the genre shifts again. So we're thinking mainly about the historical narratives, Joshua through the Kings, and that kind of period of history. So as we do that, I think there's a couple of types of stories or narratives that are helpful to be aware of.
hmm
One is like the meta narrative,
Yeah.
the Bible big story of salvation. Let's start with that. So, how would you describe the big story of salvation, James?
So the overarching narrative, well, God made people. People rejected God, so God wants to get people back. That's in its most simplest form, I suppose.
Exactly.
It's
It
a
wants to
love
get people
story.
back positively rather
Yeah,
than
yeah,
negatively.
yeah. Sorry,
I'm going
yeah.
to get you back.
Doesn't want to get revenge. No, he wants them back in relationship with him. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. That big broad stroke of the gospel. And so then as we look at the other levels of narratives, so the national narrative might be for Israel and the covenants and the way that God redeemed a people.
mm.
So in order to achieve what you've just described, he did it through a people.
Yeah,
So Israel specifically, quite uniquely, have that specific national narrative. Um, and there are all sorts of attempts by others to destroy the people of Israel, but God protects a remnant. And then we've got the narrative of Jew and Gentile, all nations, the church, the people of God. And then there are loads of individual narratives, individual stories.
yeah,
So we've got Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Joseph, who we'll look at a bit, Moses, and then after Moses, as I've mentioned, Joshua and all the judges within Judges. I think there's about 12 judges and their story. And then Ruth, incredible short story of hope, and lots of different kings like Saul and David and prophets. But we're just going to think about, maybe before we look at it as an example, the life of Joseph, think about what narratives are not. Have you ever come across, maybe you've heard a sermon, maybe you've written a sermon, maybe you've thought, about what someone's described. What can we do wrong when we try to think, that's what the story's about in the
yeah.
Bible?
So I think one of the things we can do wrong is assume that every story is there because it's got a moral to every story. Like, this is a story about not telling lies, or this is a story about, not being afraid or whatever. And we kind of assume that every story in the Bible has some sort of hidden uh, moral at the end of it.
Yeah, yeah,
that's something we
definitely.
can do wrong.
And actually, because these are historical narratives, they're primarily not like a kind of a great story off from the library
like a nursery tale or
exactly
anything like that.
Yeah, these fall into the meta narrative of God's plan and history. So yeah, they will have good morals within them.
Yeah, there will absolutely. There are things in them, and God expresses his opinions on things as we go through the stories, which is worth listening to. But the stories themselves are not like Aesop's fables or something like that.
Another one might be understanding them like an allegory.
Yes.
And allegorizing everything. Lots of hidden meanings. Everything relates to something.
Yeah.
Overly spiritualizing. Overly, even, dare I say, finding Jesus in every other verse or part of the story. Which, yes, we've already read that these things were written about me to show that I am the Son of God. Doesn't mean every part of a story in the Old Testament. We're like, oh, under that rock, is that Jesus?
Yes.
Or this particular thing represents evil spirit. This represents God. So we can add too much meaning to some stories. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think so. It's similar. I think a lot of it, the problems with the stories is we often read into them things that aren't there because we're trying to make them say something, whatever we want them to say. Yeah.
And because they're not direct teaching, we can almost get away with that.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we can go, well, for me, I think it's this.
Who can tell you wrong, Yeah, that's right.
But that is not necessarily rightly handling the word of God, as we're told by Paul in one of the epistles. But actually, it's kind of putting our agenda ahead of and respecting the literature as it is. So that's a word of warning, a reminder for me as a preacher, but also for any of us that are trying to get to grips to not put in what we want to get out or use it to serve our purpose. It's allow the story to tell its reveal it. So there's a few things. It's not direct teaching, and yet there'll be great lessons that illustrate the ethics that are found throughout the Old Testament through them. So the example of David and Bathsheba and adultery isn't a kind of primarily do not commit adultery. It's a story of humanity, of life and sin and failure and the hope of restoration. And from it reveals something that we know the Ten Commandments include. But so main characters of narratives, let's start there. The narrator. We have a narrator. Okay, we have someone that conveys the meaning of the stories that we read. We have someone that knows everything about the story because they're writing it and they know the ending. And they're communicating that. So they tell the story in the way the readers or the hearers, because not all the Jews would have read, I think, will see for themselves. So it's revealing gradually. So as we come across a story in the Bible, it's important to think, let's just identify the narrator's voice as well as focus straight on the characters, which is helpful. So let's do that now. If you could jump to Genesis 39, and whilst most of the historical narratives are kind of Joshua through, I've chosen this because Joseph is very well known to us, so maybe this will help. So the story of Joseph, if you remember that guy with the Technicolor Dreamcoat, the dreamer, one of the sons of Jacob, who ended up being, his brothers got jealous because of his dreams and his special relationship with Jacob. He was then dumped down a pit to die, essentially, but then was pulled out by the Ishmaelites, taken in a caravan all the way to Egypt, then became prosperous and ended up being essentially like a prime minister after a stint in prison and more dreams being interpreted, and then reunited with his brothers and forgave them and reconciled. And this is all prior to Moses and the Exodus. So
Yeah.
that's a recap for anyone that doesn't know. So if you could just read, we'll pick it up in chapter 39, verse 2 and 3.
Okay. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. So this is after he's been sold as a slave, as you mentioned. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned.
Okay, so we've got the narrator explaining some stuff here. A bit of the context, the situation. This is just after chapter 38, which is not about Joseph.
No.
Whereas chapter 37 is the start, I think, of the Joseph, and we get this interlude with Judah and Tamar, and then we're back into where's Joseph.
Yeah.
But what else can we spot? So you've read 2 verses. I'm going to give you 3 more, and we'll see what the narrator's emphasizing. So 21 and 23 of the same chapter.
The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favour in the eyes of the prison warder. So the warder put Joseph in charge of all those he held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Verse 23. The warder paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
Great. And then I'll read the last one. Chapter 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, Joseph says to his brothers, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Common theme from the narrator? What's he trying to tell us?
Yes, that God is in this situation. God was with Joseph. I mean, this is something he keeps coming back to in that chapter 39, even though, so I mean, obviously there are things going wrong for Joseph. He's sold into slavery, then he's in prison. But the narrator is sort of reassuring us, but God's with him in all of this.
So then we're led to think in chapter 39, how is this going to work out? It's like, God's with him. It's a part of God's plan, if you like, or he's allowed it to happen. He's doing something through it. We don't know what yet. And so we're moved along. And then right at the end, as I read, God intended it for good and for the many to be saved rather than for harm. So that's one example of a narrator's voice or emphasis in the development of a story. So that's the narrator, which looks at the why. Why is this happening? The scene is more about the when and the where. And actually, the verse that you read, did you read verse 1 or verse 2?
I read from verse 2.
Okay, could you read verse 1 of 39?
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there.
Great. So we've done the why, the narrator, and now we get the scene, the where and the when. So we've been given specific geographical references, a time, a place, a reference to a person, a captain of the guard. All of that builds a picture in our mind as we're reading it. And that's a very normal thing for historical narratives, that they give us those tools to understand the context. So you could, in many stories, put a pin in a map and get an idea of the setting, which all good stories help us with. And then we can think about the characters, the who, and characters drive the action, move the plot forward. They develop the story, and I guess for a film, you get a physical character to look at. I love books because you can kind of make that in your own mind. And in the Bible, there's not an overly large emphasis on the physical appearance. It's more on the status and the role. So in the verse you read, the captain of the guard, Egyptian Pharaoh's official, Potiphar. So there's a status, there's a role, rather than he was a tall guy with brown hair and blue eyes, or something. However, can you think of examples, maybe in this story, maybe in others, where physical appearance is significant or referred to?
Well, the one that immediately came to mind
Oh dear.
is well, actually, I think of a few. There's one. The first one that came to mind is it Elisha? It's Elisha, I think, the prophet, where he's walking along and a group of children jump out. You know this story, and start shouting at him, whatever, go away, bald head or whatever.
Yeah, baldy. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
that's right. And we all know what happens to those children. It doesn't end well. That's kind of a Roald Dahl story in a
Yeah.
sense of, well, but just that's what I thought of in reference to the fact
Okay.
that Elisha was bald.
Yeah.
Um,
So, and what's the significance with that one? I think
well,
I don't know that one.
no,
But normally, when there's a physical bit of detail in a story, it's got significance. Like in the Judges, one of them's left-handed.
yes, yeah,
Oh,
that was the other one I was thinking of.
okay.
I
Yeah.
think it's the same story. There's a story about one a guy who's so
Yeah.
fat that the sword is buried up to his sort
Exactly.
of absorbed by his flesh. Honestly, the
Yeah.
Bible's full of
It is full of it.
grisly tales, isn't it?
And Saul, taller than
Taller, yeah,
most,
yeah,
significant. And David, his appearance. So when there are references to physical attributes, there's a meaning. Because it's not normally the case that we
yeah,
get that level of description. So I find that really interesting as well.
yes.
But generally, don't expect lots of physical appearance
No,
explanations.
no.
It's more on the role, the status, the occupation. So Genesis 37:36. If you could just read that verse out.
37, 36.
Oh, that's what makes the point that we've already made.
Yes, the Potiphar
Yeah.
was captain of the guard.
Yeah. So that's the example. And the words and actions are used rather than those narrators' descriptions. So Joseph's moral character develops through the story, and maybe that that moves him from a spoilt brother to a forgiving brother. That's the journey of the story that we get with Joseph. Someone
Yeah.
think, well, I'm not surprised they're a bit jealous. He came down, or he wasn't working in the fields like they were. He was getting all these dreams. Well, I'm not surprised his brothers are a bit like, what you want to say now?
Yeah.
So we can look at the moral kind of elements that come through these characters. And then the plot, the what, the how. How does the story develop? What are the sequence of events? And it's important in Hebrew as the story moves along through the scenes, like it would in a film or a drama, chapters in a book, to make up the whole story. And actually, in this example, through to chapter 50, it's pretty much interrupted storytelling, and it's quite gripping. And we get that in various other examples as well. So it's good to think about a beginning, middle, and end. And the scene is set prior to Joseph being taken to Egypt. And then we get the main drama while he's there. And then the end as the family are reunited again. So there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a resolution, that sort of turning point when he eventually meets his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
What's he going to do? How's he going to react?
Yeah.
And it pulls us in. So there's probably other things that you might have that are good suggestions that can help us understand the structure of narratives, or when we read stories in the Bible, the questions that we should ask or things that we should look out for. I don't know if you've got any that you've come across that are helpful.
No, I feel like you've covered certainly all the major ones. Like just it's always important, I think, to know to just take a step back and look at when this particular story is happening, like what happened before and after it. Like where is this story placed in that meta narrative or the overall, or even the story of the book, or so on.
Yeah, that's it. And I think there isn't always. It's not like a story has one main point that we have to just get.
Yeah.
I think there's some Bible teachers would take that approach.
Yeah.
They go, there's a key to this.
That's right.
Find the key and you unlock it all. And I think, yeah, there can be, but God speaks powerfully in different ways to us
quite.
through different aspects of the story. And so if you find like what you feel like is at the heart of it, great, but don't assume that that's it.
Yeah, that's right.
And God can impress on us different aspects of his character, especially when it comes to preaching or teaching in local settings that might be particularly relevant for a time. So yeah, looking out, as we've said, for the kind of character, plot, the progression, God in the story as well. Some stories in the Bible don't have God mentioned at all. I think it's Esther. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't think Esther's God is mentioned at all in the book of Esther. Yeah, by name.
And yet behind the scenes, you're very aware, it's implied that God is at work. So stories are used in quite a varied way and interspersed with other forms of literature, like the story of Job. It's a story, but full of wisdom and poetry, you might say, rather than just a typical narrative form. And so I think, the kind of point that would be good to just remind is to say, looking for God in the narrative in an appropriate way, that sometimes we can be drawn to, I need to be like Joseph, or what Joseph is the hero.
Yes, yeah.
Or I'm David fighting my Goliath.
Yes,
Or I need to have faith like Daniel and overcome the lions by sheer trust. And there can be truth in those things. But sometimes I think maybe the story's about more than us imitating the Old Testament character.
Yes.
Maybe God's the hero.
Yeah.
Maybe it reveals the need for some perfect man who can live up to the law and be righteous and be not just a man after God's own heart like David was, but the man who was God and had God's heart and is called Jesus. So we look at the ultimate character as well as the people and what we can learn and see that they point us towards or are a prototype for through the story. So we've talked about the dangers and what to avoid if we're reading or teaching or thinking about understanding stories, allegories. There's just a couple of others that I wanted to highlight as well.
Yeah.
One is personalizing it.
Yes.
So we read a really good story. We kind of do okay at understanding what the characters are doing, the plot. But then we just jump to going, for me, this. I'm going to apply it straight to myself. And I think when we do that with any part of the Bible, we're missing out a step in the interpretation process, which is what did it mean for them?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you just explain what does it mean? Why is that a significant step before we get to us?
Well, because I think particularly when it comes to reading the Bible, you need to bear in mind who it was written for. Like, it was originally aimed at a certain particular group of people. I mean, when we talked about ages ago now, it seems, we did a podcast on, say, the Gospels. I remember doing that, and one of the things that changes the way you read the Gospel is when you know who it was originally written for. And you can miss some things, or you can make a mistake in applying it if you don't catch some of the things that the original audience would know or pick up on.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think that the key is understanding it and appreciating it in its form the best we can. I mean, there'll always be gaps.
There's always a distance between us and the audience.
But we need to work a bit harder sometimes at the context, getting that context right, understanding the historical setting, the culture, the world that we're reading the story in. And if you're quite new to faith, and if you're, earlier on in your journey of reading the Bible, then that's okay. You can read these stories and go, wow, and God will, I believe, reveal truth and help you grow in your faith. But as we grow in faith, part of that is growing in our understanding of the Bible and study. Then let's put some time into understanding the context where it is in the Bible, so that we can dig a bit deeper and see really what this story can reveal about God, about us, about for the people at the time, but also then apply it into our situations and rightly see Jesus in the right place.
And that's one way we can prevent doing just what you've been talking about, of making the story say what we want it to say.
Yeah.
And trying to making that effort to try and understand what it originally said, and then looking at how that can be applied.
Yeah.
Is helpful.
Definitely. Yeah. So to finish with, I've got, I think, 9 principles of interpretation that I'll just run through.
Okay.
I won't explain them. They're very self-evident.
Right.
Don't you worry. So if you're excited to get into some of the stories of the Old Testament, great. Love them, enjoy them. But remember these things. First one, they don't usually teach doctrine. So they might reveal an aspect of doctrine, but they don't teach it like you would expect a letter in the New Testament to. They do illustrate a doctrine taught elsewhere.
Yes.
So they reveal something, they confirm, and that brings a consistency to the Bible. They record what happened, not what should have happened. So maybe, again, if you're new to reading the Bible, you think, oh, well, I don't agree with that. Well, yeah, that's people.
Yes.
That's failings and mistakes. It's a historical record. Number 4, what people do in narratives isn't necessarily what you should do.
Yes.
Because it can be quite easy. Oh, he did that, I'll do that.
Yeah.
But again, we're missing out the journey of understanding it in its context and meaning, and applying it appropriately to our situation and what God, in light of Christ and the Spirit of God, call us to do. 5, most characters are far from perfect. So let's not overly focus on the individual. And then 6, all narratives are selective and incomplete. So there's a process, isn't it, of the narrator, the author, choosing what to focus on within the story. Which I find quite exciting, because then what the details that are there are really meant to be there. So with Joshua and Rahab, for example, the fact that there was scarlet ribbon hung out of the doorframe. Why scarlet? Why not anything? Why are we given that bit of information? Why did they hide in the ceiling under the flax? Some of these things I don't know the answer to. Others of them I do. But pondering, thinking. 7, they aren't written to answer all our theological questions. Actually, Job's just probably the greatest example. Opens up a huge topic of suffering and life and hurt and pain and lament and hope. It doesn't solve it. It presents it. 8, may teach explicitly or implicitly. Let's just listen to the stories and see, but it may well be implied rather than anything else. And then finally, God is the hero of all the biblical narratives, because we keep in mind the meta narrative. And hopefully some of those principles are helpful and just help us a little bit more as we engage with these.
They're very good principles. Definitely. I think having those in mind when you come to a biblical text, particularly if you've got to prepare some sort of communication based on it, those are really helpful things to hold on to.
Good. So there we go. Let's enjoy our stories.
Thanks. So stories are very important. That the whole Bible is really, as you said, this meta-narrative, this one story, just told in many different ways, from many different perspectives, over many hundreds of years. But it's one story, and we're also part of that same story, as you also said. So thank you, Oz, and thank you for being a part of our story today. And may God be with you as you go out and live his story wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and however you're doing it, to the best of your ability.